Thank you so much. This is joint work with Jack Willis at Columbia and Yang Yu, who's currently a grad student at Harvard, but who's going to the HKU Finance Department next year. And as you heard, Jack and I will be sharing the presentation. You know, this paper got its start several years ago when I was teaching development economics to grad students, and Jack was the teaching assistant for the class. And I normally start the class with some facts, including facts on growth. And you know, I draw on the empirical literature from the 90s when I was a grad student, and you know, when there was just a lot of empirical research on the determinants of growth. And a key stylized fact from that time, and that is put in textbooks, and that I, until several years ago, I used to teach, was that there's no tendency for convergence. Maybe we could go next slide. And this is an example of showing that relationship from the 90s. Here's a quote from Barrow, who did a lot of work on this area. You know, if anything, this graph of growth rates against log GDP per worker is maybe slightly upward sloping. And Pritchett has works pointing out that if you take a longer run historical perspective, there's clearly been divergence. From 1870 to 1990, the ratio of per capita incomes between the richest and the poorest countries increased by roughly a factor of 5. So that's one response to this is so obviously this is a challenge to the idea that growth is based either on accumulation of capital with decreasing returns, or models where copying technology is easier than developing it. And one response to this is a set of endogenous growth models, for example, AK models that would predict divergence. So Romer 1986, for example. There are also people sort of had poverty trap models at the country level. Another response was the conditional convergence literature, which argued that if you control for human capital or policies or perhaps institutions, then you would get convergence conditional on that. So there was very strong convergence within the OECD, for example. And so we, in updating the things for the class, thought maybe that fact's not right. Maybe we should check it. And indeed, here's the relationship. And for the decade by decade, you can see that since the 2000s, there's quite strong convergence. That's obviously very hard to reconcile with any type of AK growth model, which would predict divergence. Probably with poverty trap models as well. We've done some checking for that. So we're going to focus a lot on conditional convergence models, just because they're, at least at first pass, might be consistent with this. Okay, why don't we go on? This shows things in just a somewhat more detailed year by year what the beta coefficient is. You can see that there's a strong trend towards convergence since the 1980s. You might even say there's converging towards convergence since that period. And this leads to about 0.7% convergence rate at the end of the period. That's less than Barrow's 2% iron law, but still substantial change. Okay. Let me mention a couple of and this is very hard, as I say, hard to reconcile with the AK models. Let me mention a couple of other papers. Johnson and Papageorgiou look at this data. They still argue there's convergence because they look at the whole period since 1960. We think it's worth breaking this out a little bit, but we agree if you look through for the whole period, you don't see a convergence. More closely related, I think, are some papers by Roy et al. And Patel et al. Arvind Subramanian is author of both of those, and I think those find results that are quite similar to the ones we have, but we'll take it in a particular direction. Why don't we go ahead? one thing is we tried to break this out. It doesn't look like, growth, we find that growth has increased in all income quartiles except the richest since the mid-1980s. Partly this is a matter of faster catch-up. So growth increased in the first through third quartiles from the early 80s until the early 00s, and then fell since. There's partly a slowdown at the frontier. So the fourth quartile growth, you can see, dropped dramatically since the late 90s. It was the fastest growing in the 80s and then slowed down. So that's when we tried to look here, is this some sort of threshold level of income? You get above that and then you start to converge. It doesn't really, we didn't find a lot of evidence for that type of story. Why don't we go on? So one question is this just, maybe this is just a blip. It's just a temporary fact thing. Roderick noted some related facts in 2013. They pointed to high commodity prices. I think it's getting harder, not impossible, to tell that story now the trend's been going on so long. It also seems robust to removing resource-rich countries. Doesn't seem to be driven just by China and India or sub-Saharan Africa. It doesn't look like this is either driven only by the reduction in growth disasters, although there's been a dramatic reduction in growth disasters, or an increase in growth miracles. If we're thinking about this in terms of the conditional convergence literature, you can think of two types of stories. One would be that there's faster convergence conditional on covariates like human capital, policies, institutions, culture. That could be due to globalization that makes easier for technology to flow across areas or trade and communication. The other story would be maybe the determinants of income levels in the conditional convergence literature have themselves improved and converged. It is interesting that a lot of this happened since the mid 80s or so. Maybe this has something to do with the end of the Cold War, the huge growth of democratization, the fall in conflict, and perhaps the rise of the Washington Consensus. So let me turn it over to Jack to take it from here.
Thanks very much, Michael. So digging a little into this, the second of those stories, so the convergence of the determinants of the steady state level of income. While the recent literature on sort of growth in institutions seeks to identify the causal impacts of institutions and culture on development through their historical determinants, emphasizing their stability and persistence, we would argue that whilst their empirical strategy sort of means that they have to focus on historical determinants, their findings are not inconsistent with the fact that other important determinants of growth could be changing potentially quite rapidly recently. And so to study whether such correlates of income and growth have been changing and how, we make the following imperfect classification of such correlates. So we begin with the sort of solo fundamentals or enhanced solo fundamentals, which are investment rate, population growth rate, and years of education. Those variables which feature in the solo model and are in sort of all growth regression papers. Then we turn to short run correlates, those for which we have time variation and we think may change on a short time period, typically going to be policy variables. Then we can think of long-run correlates, those correlates which are going to change very slowly or potentially not even at all, and we're not going to have time-varying data for them. And these can be typically sort of institutions or geographical variables. And then culture. Okay, and so we're going to first of all study the evolution over the last 50 years of these groups of correlates of growth and income. So for the solo fundamentals and the short-run correlates, to avoid cherry picking, we start from the correlates which are listed in the chapter on growth economics from the Handbook of Economic Growth. Those variables which are listed as being in important growth regression papers in the literature. So we construct a panel of the variables which are available for at least 50 countries since 96. We find 35 policy and institution variables, and we put them in, we classify them in 5 domains. This leads to an unbalanced panels of variables which are in different units. And so we have a number of sort of econometric challenges. One thing we do is we start from 1985 for this analysis if possible. The first date which is available if those variables are not available by 1985. We also go further back and report trends since 1960, but the data availability is more patchy. We standardize correlates by their variance in 1985 throughout. Some other econometric issues, we're concerned that measurement error might generate beta convergence through mean reversion. And so we also look at sigma convergence. There's top coding discreteness. This leads us to choose variables accordingly to try and avoid such issues. And also to try and reduce the role of noise, we do exercises with different aggregates of correlates. So the results of this first exercise. So overall, we find that solar fundamentals and short-run correlates have improved and converged substantially from 1985 to today. So this is a table just summarizing the changes for some of the most important variables. Those in red are the solar fundamentals. Those in blue are other short-run correlates. So 18 of the 20 variables that we looked at are highly correlated with income in 1985. That's what the second column is showing. Of these 18, 15 improved significantly. So column 3 shows in units of the standard deviation in 1985, what was the average change from 1985 to 2015. Here, what we mean by improved, we should be very specific, we mean moved on average in the direction associated with higher income. So at the same time as this improvement, there was also a convergence. So 17 out of 20 of these variables converged significantly. And if we look back before 85, from 1960 onwards, this is a less careful analysis because, as I say, variables are becoming available over time for different countries. But we find a similar but slower trend towards convergence and improvement. So we also did a similar exercise with culture, which I think we would tend to think of as fairly stable. So we did this using the World Value Surveys. There we find, out of 10 cultural variables that we look at, we found convergence in 8 at an average beta convergence rate of 3%. And just to highlight, there's a substantial literature in political science and sociology studying these trends and their causes. So overall, pretty substantial improvement and convergence in these institutions across countries. So then the next obvious natural question is, to what extent are these two sets of trends related? So Michael showed you a convergence towards a trend towards convergence in income. And then I showed you a convergence in the correlates of growth and income since 1985. Now, obviously answering this question causally is going to be very difficult. We're not going to aim to do that. Sort of causally, the relationships could go either way. So modernization theory would suggest that as incomes increase, policies, institutions, culture modernize on the one hand. On the other hand, growth theory, growth regressions, which suggest that as policies and institutions improve, then growth will become faster. So recent literature uses instrumental variables and historical approaches to try and identify both of those directions causally. So Daron, for instance, has work looking at both directions for the link between democracy and income and growth. We're instead just going to update 2 cross-country regressions, essentially, see what's happened to them. And this is going to have the advantage that it lets us to think of it allows us to think about what's happened to conditional convergence relative to absolute convergence. So in particular, so regression 1 on this page is what Michael presented, the sort of canonical unconditional convergence regression. And we've seen a trend in that beta over time. Then we look at, well, what's happened to the correlate income relationships? So just regressing correlates, policies, institutions, culture on income. Then we look at what's happened to growth correlate relationships. So classical growth regressions. So regressing, in our case, it's going to be 10-year growth regressed upon income and then correlates. which also is the same as the conditional convergence regressions. And then the advantage of thinking about 2 and 3 together and trends in delta and trends in lambda is that just the simple omitted variable bias formula, when doing this one correlate at a time, tells us that the gap between absolute convergence and conditional convergence is just the product of those two slopes, the correlate income slope and the growth correlate slope. So as we see what's happened to those two slopes, this is going to give us an inclination for whether absolute convergence has trended towards conditional convergence. So I'll walk through those results quickly. The main specification is comparing 1985 to sort of today, but we also present trends since 1960, although again, before 1985, the data availability is more patchy, so that's a sort of secondary analysis. So first of all, the correlate income relationship, so regressing policies and institutions on income. Slopes since 85 to today have changed relatively little for all of the classes of correlates that we consider, although changes in income predict little of the changes in the correlates if we took those baseline 1985 relationships as causal. So the levels of these relationships have changed quite a lot. On growth regression coefficients, they're relatively stable for solo fundamentals. So in sort of 2005 to 2015, the coefficients look fairly similar to they did in 1985 to 1995. So we view that as a success for neoclassical growth model, for the neoclassical growth model, although this is partly mechanical for population growth. Short run correlates policies show much less persistence, and their coefficients have shrunk substantially. Long run correlates and cultural variables are somewhere in between. So they have also shrunk quite a lot, but they show more persistence than the short run correlates. So linking those two trends together, if we think about what's happened to the omitted variable bias from not conditioning on correlates when we think about absolute convergence, or when we think about convergence. So remember the difference between the absolute convergence coefficient and the conditional convergence coefficient can be just written as the product of these two slopes. So this is shrunk from 1985 to 2005. So what this plot is correlate by correlate. Here I'm just showing you for the solo fundamentals and the short run correlates. The product of those two slopes on the x-axis in 1985 and the same product on the y-axis in 2005. And so you can see there's been a general flattening and reduction. So most of these points are beneath the 45-degree line. And you can see that if we fit a line to those points, there's much more the autocorrelation for the solo fundamentals than for the other short run correlates. And so what's this telling us? Well, if this difference is greater than 0, then conditioning on these variables increases convergence. If it is less than 0, conditioning decreases convergence. And so there's been a general reduction in the effect of conditioning, I say. And so absolute convergence has, in a sense, converged towards conditional convergence. This is to show you the trend in those average variables since 1960. As I say, this is more speculative because before, or less precisely done, carefully done, because before 1985, many of the variables are missing for many countries. And so the reason there's a lot of lines is because we tried to do a balanced panel exercise. But similar results, if anything, these omitted variable bias, that is the distance between conditional convergence and absolute convergence, sort of peaked in around 1980 and has since reduced substantially, although remained relatively stable for solar fundamentals.
Jack, sorry to interrupt, but 1 minute warning.
Sure, thank you, Matti. And so the multivariate approach is tricky because there's many ways in which you can do this, but this is just to show that overall we think that absolute convergence has trended towards conditional convergence. So to conclude, to pull those results together, so there's been a trend towards income convergence since 1990, convergence since 2000. Policies, institutions, and culture have converged towards those of rich countries since 1960, faster since 1980. Growth regressions for solo fundamentals have remained relatively stable, while those for other correlates were largest in the 1980s and have since shrunk substantially. Absolute convergence has converged towards conditional convergence since 1990. And so what changed? We had this, correlates were converging before 1990, but it's only post 1990 where their regression coefficients seem to have shrunk. So is this to do with faster convergence conditional on correlates, which could be related to globalization, or is this indeed to do with the convergence of correlates through the end of the Cold War, democratization, Washington Consensus, etc., which is what our analysis is focused on? Our speculative narrative, it is speculative. I don't think we fundamentally know, but this has the advantage of parsimony, is that our measures of policies and institutions are noisy measures of some fundamentals which really do matter. Since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and the adoption of the Washington Consensus, there's been rapid convergence in policies and institutions, both in our measures of them and in the fundamentals. Remaining differences in our measures may not be indicative of remaining differences in fundamentals. So thank you very much, and I should apologize to the discussants because we were working on this right up to the wire, and we're very much looking forward to that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Our first discussant is Rohini Pande. You're on mute.
Yeah, thanks. Jack, if you could unshare.
Good point.
Great. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for inviting me to discuss this paper. It certainly took me back to graduate school. And this is joint with Niels. And so let me start by sort of summarizing the paper and then really turning to my discussion, which, as you'll see, is about trying to think about how to link what they find to some of the issues that I would say development economists think about, perhaps more on the micro level, but I think more generally also in thinking about the welfare implications of GDP per capita. So the paper is incredibly clearly written, and I think Michael and Jack gave a great presentation. And it revolves around a certain central fact, which is that earlier tests of the neoclassical growth model tended to find conditional convergence. You only see convergence after conditioning on human capital, policies, and institutions. What the authors do here is they extend this data, in most cases, to 2015, and find a trend towards unconditional convergence since mid-1980s, absolute convergence since 2000. And as Michael mentioned, this is sort of below the iron law of 2%, but is quite substantial. They also look then at the conditioning variables and find that the short-run correlates, culture, and the enhanced solo fundamentals all seem to show some convergence towards beta convergence. I think the nice part of the paper is that it doesn't stop with just documenting this fact, but then sort of tries to think a little bit about proximate causes. So they show that this is not just because there are fewer disaster countries. I think there's been a long history in development economics of thinking of countries that have, say, big civil conflicts and disastrous growth performance for a few years. It's not just China that's driving it. These results survive independent of that. There is some evidence that the richest countries are slowing down post-2005. But again, even if you remove the top quartile, the convergence exists even though it's weaker. There are some laggards, and I think this very much reflects a lot of the discussion in development policy today is the belief that the frontier of what needs to happen in development is really trying to understand how to increase the growth performance in sub-Saharan Africa. They note that there doesn't seem to be what Patel et al. Describe in that paper, in the same vein, is there appears to be a middle income trap. And in fact, some of the strongest growth comes from the second quartile of countries. And this is going to be a group of countries, partly because a group of countries I worked on quite a lot that I'm going to focus quite a lot of my discussion on. I think it's a very impressive collation of data sets, and I appreciated the careful standardization of conditioning variables. I think the authors were very careful to make sure on their correlates that they were not cherry picking. And they're very cognizant of interpretation issues. So, as a discussant, you go in hoping you can make some easy comments on things like causality, but the authors actually are quite careful in noting that their evidence is largely suggestive. So that, of course, at some level makes the task of discussing somewhat harder, but I felt what I wanted to do was situate these results in where the development discussions have gone, and actually broaden it out to not just being what microeconomists say versus macroeconomists, but really what are social scientists talking about right now. So if you think about how anthropologists are thinking about development, sort of what are their concerns when they think about the economists' focus on growth. So I think that a lot of the discussion really is about when you take GDP per capita at the country level, what, if anything, does it tell us today about the welfare implications of welfare implications at the individual, community, or regional level? And so I want to first talk about what has been happening with the spatial location of poverty and why I think that makes looking at convergence just at the country level perhaps less interesting if what we care about is the poorest households across the world. I also want to talk about how the nature of structural transformation has changed and what that again means for the breakdown between, if you want, kind of productivity increases and the share going to labor of income. And then finally, kind of thinking about these policies, as Jack said towards the end, he's thinking a little bit, they're thinking a little bit in terms of some underlying fundamentals. But I think as we are seeing right now through the period we're going through, fundamentals change. And I think it's important for us to think about what lies ahead, not just in terms of COVID, but I think very importantly in terms of climate change, which is going to affect particularly the type of growth that lower income countries are going to be able to engage in. So countries are now converging. Let's take that as given and ask, does it matter? So, Paul Collier a while ago wrote a book kind of talking about the bottom billion. And I think now there are a number of people, Andy Sumner is sort of a leader in this area, who sort of described that really the spatial distribution of poverty looks very different. So just to give you a very quick review, if you look across the kind of the arc of centuries, colonialism was a huge influence. And so what we see, if you say compare 1870 to 2000, certainly what matters more is where you live. And I think it'd be fair to say that many people think that colonialism is a reason why, there's a substantive difference across countries. But if you look more recently, say since 1980, what you see is a larger part of global inequality is now explained by within country inequality. So Branko Milanovic has done a lot of work here, and if you compare 1988, 80% of global income inequality was across countries. By 2013, it was down to 49%. So then you can ask, well, what's going on? What is going on is two things. So this is some work that I've done with others. So, one good news is, of course, that rates of poverty have hugely gone down. So if you look at 1987, roughly 30% of the world's population lived under $1.90 a day. By 2015, it was about 13%. But what also happened is the countries that grew did not grow equally. And these very often were large populous countries like India and Nigeria, and including China as well. And so what you see is that by 2015, the majority of the world's poor no longer lived in the poorest countries. So our idea that poor people live in poor countries is not true, at least today in the data, and we can discuss later whether we think this is a passing moment or whether COVID has possibly made this more permanent. And of course, the fact why we are seeing this, that poor people are living in richer countries, is because there's greater inequality. So there are 5 high poverty middle income countries, which I've called in my work as HIPMEs, that are today home to roughly half of the world's poorest. And mapping this to the author's data, these are typically countries that will fall in the second quartile of their GDP distribution. And so what's happening within these countries is going to have an outsized impact if you really want to think about the convergence as being that between rich and poor regions, communities, or households, not just countries. So this, I think, is a good illustration. So on the left-hand side, these two pictures are of countries, DRC and Ethiopia. Both of these are in the first quartile. These are poor countries. These are countries that in a convergence regression, we say are getting left behind. If you look at the two on the right, these are regions between countries that are in the second quartile, that show a fast growth. And you know, so somewhat depressing fact is that if you took the state of Bihar in India and you consider it as a country, it would be the world's most populous low-income country today. And that really is, I think, the nature in which we've seen inequality change. This is just another way of showing you that there is regional inequality. And of course, there's also rising inequality in incomes, right? So in India, if you look at the green line, the share of income going to the top 1% of the income distribution in 1980 was roughly 7%, and now it's over 20%, and the pandemic has, if anything, increased this. So what does this mean? I think it means that I think it's important for us, if you want to think about welfare, to really ask what's happening within countries. I think it's a good point to remind ourselves that one of the kind of classic convergence results, which was convergence within across US states, actually stopped being true in the 2000s. So Ganong and Shao show us that regional convergence in the US no longer holds. And they argue that's again because of the nature of inequality and place-based inequality. I suspect if you look in the data, you're going to see something similar happening, certainly for some of these bigger second quartile countries, and it would be interesting to know if that's happening more generally. So let me turn to a second point, which I think is important for thinking about welfare, which is the nature of structural transformation. So historically, we think of economic development sort of as a decline in the share of agriculture in both the country's income and labor. And you know, we thought manufacturing was supposed to have this great double advantage. It both was more productive than farming and absorbed a large population share. So in the 1970s, countries like Germany and the UK would have roughly 50% of their population in manufacturing. That's no longer true, right? So if you look at the data, again, at the second quartile, high poverty, middle income countries, China's a level higher at around 20% manufacturing share. But look at a country like Kenya. If anything, this entire period has seen the share of population in manufacturing, at least according to ILO data, significantly declining. What about services? Would that come in instead as we move out? Services is productive, but you know, my colleagues, Fan, Peters, and Zilibotti have worked now on services in India, showing that these are very urban oriented. They're good for consumers in urban areas, but they're not employing a lot of people. They're very limited employment gains. And so I think what you're seeing now is some of this GDP convergence is certainly coming from productive output in manufacturing and services, but this is not translating into increased labor shares. So Macmillan, Roderick, and others have some nice work using microdata from Ethiopia and Tanzania, showing that you sort of have two sets of firms. You have larger firms that have superior productivity performance, but are not expanding employment. And then you have this sort of informal sector that's absorbing employment, but lacks productivity growth. And coming to the perspective of what this matters for policy, I think an important point made by them and others is that some of this is this homogenization of global supply chains, which you know, is leading to capital-intensive technology at a much higher rate, and therefore weakening the link between GDP convergence and household well-being. So that, I think, is just trying to situate this facts of absolute convergence in terms of what does this mean for the world's poor or less well-off. Let me now turn to thinking about how we use these findings to think about predictions for the future. So, you know, the optimistic view is in the long run, you know, there was absolute convergence. It was shocked off that path, possibly by colonialism, and now we're gradually returning to it as the Washington consensus happens, as, you know, really bad events stop happening. But let me actually argue that I think the world is one in which anomalies are common in the medium run. And so when we look ahead, I'm not sure we can actually look at these sort of Washington consensus policies and say what the first quartile needs is for these policies to be implemented. The world, from what we can see, looks quite different, which concerns me about the predictive power of saying that there is convergence in these policies. So what are the reasons for concern? So I think in the near run, one of the most important factors that we see is this not just culture convergence, but political institutions convergence. But even before COVID, inequality has been terrible in many ways. One of the things it has also done is I think there's a lot of evidence of democratic backsliding. This may suggest that we may see policy reversals coming not precisely because we're now beginning to see democratic backsliding. And then that is accentuated very often by COVID. And then, as I said, I think really the most it's not even the elephant in the room anymore, is that climate breakdown. So the kind of future of that neoclassical growth model is just less likely to be true going ahead if we want to all survive. So this just shows you one variable. It looks the same for polity. I just did it for varieties of democracy because I use that a bit more in my work. This just divides on the left-hand side by the quartiles that the authors use. And you can see convergence on this measure and most measures. But now if you break it down by these big countries and you look at the trends, you basically start seeing across a lot of countries post around 2010 declines. So the red line here is India. Electoral democracy has seen very significant declines. By this measure, it's supposed to now be an electoral autocracy. If you look at media freedom, you see the same thing. Broad aggregates seem to be converging, but there's a lot of breakdown. And then if you look at what happened during the pandemic, you actually see, if anything, this trend was accentuated. So this is just looking at the share of countries which have violations of different democratic standards. Darker colors are more violations. And I'd focus on type 7, which is restrictions on the media. And as you can see, in the share of countries, a majority of them saw some set of restrictions on the media. And this is all happening at the same time as we know, we're now seeing the first rise in global poverty in the 21st century. IMF's most recent World Economic Outlook just a couple of days ago predicted that the reason why the global economy will remain 3% smaller in 2024 is largely going to be driven by these sort of lower middle income countries which just don't have that fiscal capacity to respond. And I think here one thing that's kind of interesting to keep in mind is that when in the paper, they sort of define some policies as development oriented, actually tax policy doesn't show up. So in 1985, apparently redistribution was not associated with improvements in GDP. But it's very hard to look at the data today and believe that we don't need kind of more domestic redistribution. So let me turn to my last point, which is really on carbon convergence. So I think what we see in the data, and at least from what I've read and talked to others about, there may be technological leapfrogging. So there may be better technologies available, but we're not seeing energy leapfrogging. So what this means is that as countries are getting richer, they're getting much more energy intensive. So Arthur Bentham has some very nice work here. So this is a graph from his paper that shows that if you look at just energy consumption against GDP, and you look at countries that were industrialized early or less developed countries today, it's a 45-degree line. They may be using different technologies, but they're all moving to become more energy intensive. And combine this with the fact that if you think about just climate breakdowns, some of the most exposed populations are countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So if we just look ahead and we look at the kind of projections that we heard about, Mar talk about in her discussion on the last talk, we're either just growth is not going to happen in a lot of these countries because we're going to have just huge climate breakdowns, or if we manage to change things, it's going to be much more expensive. And those policies are not the set of policies that we were even thinking about in 1985. And so, there are many different futures, but I feel they all need us to think about new policies and possibly, not just think about development-oriented policies, but possibly also policies that are going to help with climate change.
Rohini,
Let me just kind of summarize. Yeah. I think this paper documents a trend, as far as I could tell, on absolute convergence using a particular specification and provides suggestive evidence that policy convergence played a role. I think my comments really, I wanted to make 2 points. First, I think it would be very valuable to provide us some narrative in the paper on how to link this country level convergence to human welfare. I think the time when it was written in 1990s, there was, I think, a much stronger presumption that poor people were in poor countries. And so if we have poor countries growing faster, we're going to see gains in welfare. I think what we've seen in the last 2 decades, and that's why I broadened it out to say this is what social scientists are arguing about, I think has made people quite concerned about the impacts of growth for poorer households. And then the second thing is, I think kind of also it'd be useful to interpret what we should think about these policies. I don't know what the fundamentals are in a world where, for instance, climate change is a huge part of what we see ahead. And so it'd be good if the authors can help us think a bit about that. But let me stop here and thank you very much. I really enjoyed reading the paper.
Thank you very much for your comments. Our next discussant is Daron Acemoglu.
Well, thank you, Marty, and thank you, Erik and Marty, for inviting me. This paper has been very thought-provoking for me and Carlos, who is a third-year PhD student at MIT, and he's responsible for all the good things in the discussion, and I'll take the blame for all the bad things. And I also really enjoyed Rohini's discussion, and I completely endorse all of her points. And the nice thing is that there is one point of contact between us, and then other than that, they are very complementary, I think. So I'm actually going to, Carlos and I are going to focus on the statistical framework that Michael, Jack, and Yang have proposed and stay at the country level. But I think Rohini is completely right that the within country material is increasingly important. So I don't need to spend much time on this slide because Michael and Jack gave an excellent, very clear discussion. So they are revisiting the Barrow-Barrow MIT convergence issues. And there are 3 big results in the paper, as opposed to what the past literature found 30 years ago. There's a trend towards absolute convergence or unconditional convergence. This has been accompanied with rapid convergence of among some of the correlates, such as human capital, policies, institutions, some culture. And the relationship between these correlates and growth has become flatter, which may be because policies and institutions have converged, or perhaps they matter less for a variety of reasons. So Carlos and I have downloaded the data and repeated all of the analysis that Jack, Yang, and Michael did, and we've replicated all of their results. So there's no disagreement on the results, but we're going to somewhat disagree with some of the interpretation. So obviously, whether the world is getting more or less unequal is very important, modulo Rohini's comments, and the authors are making an important contribution as a descriptive fact here. But the question is, how do we interpret this descriptive fact using more economically relevant relationship? That really forces us to go to a causal framework. I think the literature before the authors was rightly quite skeptical that Barrow's growth regressions really corresponded to a causal framework, and there's some fixes. And I think how you think what the underlying causal framework is going to be very important. And this matters because even though the authors are very upfront that they are providing descriptive results, they do interpret it through some sort of economic relations. For example, convergence has converged so that institutions and policies matter less. You know, this is taken rather seriously by the authors and by Rohini as well, despite her great skepticism in general. So people are going to mention this as an important result. So I'm going to argue that this isn't really the right way to think about it. In fact, I'm going to argue is that the biases of the conditional, unconditional estimates have behaved differently, and those are the things that have converged. And this, for example, doesn't say that we shouldn't worry about the retreat of democracy. That's a big fact. Rohini and I touch on that one. Since 2006, in every year, Freedom House has many more countries going back on democracy than forward. So if, for example, we have really convergent or absolute convergence and the correlate growth relationship for institutions has become flatter, we shouldn't worry too much about this from an economic point of view. We may worry about a media or political rights point of view, but I'm going to show you that, in fact, we should worry about this from an economic point of view as well. Okay, so let me start with a minimal causal framework that I think we need, and I'm going to interpret things from that perspective. And then I'll show you what we have found in terms of why the absolute convergence has converged, and what are the different components of it, and then do the same thing for the correlate growth relationship. So here is a minimal framework that I'm going to propose. This is, by the way, exactly the model that we start from in my paper with Pasquale Restrepo, Jim Robinson, and Suresh Naidu on democracy and growth, which I'm going to come back to as one specific application later on. So the key difference here from what the authors do is this: cross-country fixed effects. So in the absence of cross-country fixed effects, all of the differences across levels of countries are either going to be absent if there are no covariates, as in the unconditional cross-convergence regression, or only going to be captured by a limited set of covariates. And again, my work has found that whether you include those country fixed effects has phenomenal implications in terms of everything being very different when you do or do not include them in a variety of contexts, and certainly when you look at the results of certain short-run institutions such as democracy and so on. So I'm going to come to that. So in what follows, I'm going to maintain that this is the right data generating process, and then look at what happens. Carlos and I are going to look at what happens when you estimate the models that Jack, Young, and Michael are estimating. So let's start with this model. So this is the one that in the first half of the paper, or in the first third of the paper, the authors estimate. So critically, the cross-country fixed effects are not present. So let's suppose, following what they do, is that there are no covariates. So I'm going to come back to the role of the covariates, but I want to separate it. So I'm going to assume that BCs are equal to 0. But it's convenient to understand what's going on to go back and think that this convergence coefficient is country specific. So I'm going to write that as rho C. I apologize, we are using different notation for it with Michael and Jack. They use beta, and for the convergence one, we use rho. We followed our democracy and growth paper. So rho is the estimate that used to be positive and is now negative. That's the convergence of convergence, and I'm going to show you exactly that's the pattern in the data. So the authors are absolutely right. So here is one basic result. So suppose that the right data generating process is in fact the model that I put up with the cross-country fixed effects, but no covariates, so that the cross-country fixed effects and the rho C's being different are the only thing. Then you can easily show, very standard analysis, that the probability limit of the variable that they estimate is a combination of these rho C's, country-specific convergence parameters. However, it's not anything that can be interpreted as local average treatment effects or anything like that. These omega C's can be negative. I'll show you they are, in fact, in the data. And they do not sum to 1. If you want to turn them into something that looks a little bit more like weights, here is a transformation in the second part. So these are the theta C's. So you can write the probability limit as this term, which looks a little bit like an average, but unfortunately there is this bias term here. And we'll see that this bias term is big and has its own dynamics. And you can see that already, and it's very intuitive, if you take the effective sample size to infinity, so the consecutive periods for each country to infinity, then many of these things actually converge to 0, and most importantly, the plim of rho hat converges to 0. Why is that? Well, you know, the bias has a very simple structure here. The source of the bias is that the country fixed effects and initial conditions are, of course, correlated. They couldn't be otherwise. That would be a really weird draw of the cross-sectional distribution. But that bias completely goes into their rho hat estimate. But as I make the sample longer and longer, that bias is so big because the only way you can understand countries being in very different parts of the income distribution in their model is to set the absolute convergence to 0. Because there's no other way for countries to differ in the long run. Okay. So this has major implications. And this omitted variable bias might be quite big and might have its own dynamics, as I'm going to show you. And since time is short, let me just jump into it. So I'm going to show that in 3 steps. First of all, I'm going to try to unpack why they get the rho hat that they get. Here is, again, our model with beta c's equal to 0. This is like a time series model, if you want. You can estimate this country by country, except that we have time effects, so we estimate it all together. So this is the distribution of the rho c's. You see the distribution. It has almost no weight on positives. Almost every country has a negative rho c. It's a time series pattern. So how come when you average these rho c's, you're getting a rho hat? Well, that's the bias. That's because you're getting really weird weights. Many countries have negative weight, 37% of them, and some, like Panama, have a huge negative weight. Again, this is just, if the underlying model is the one that I showed with the cross-country fixed effects, the model without cross-country fixed effects has to twist itself into bits, into knots, in order to be able to match it, and that's where this is coming from. So here is a different way of doing it. This is what you would get in the full sample. This is what you are, and the full sample, this is what the Johnson and Papageorgiou, for example, does it, not by decade, but the full sample. This is what you would get as the average, and here is the bias term, which is much larger. But more importantly, I think for the discussion at hand about absolute convergence and what it means, this bias is not constant. This is the, when Carlos and I compute the bias for the full sample. Now here it is, how it looks like. This is their estimate. This is some average of the rho c's that is interpretable, and this is the bias. Look at the orange. This is what the average of the rho c's is doing. It's hardly budging. It's negative. Rho c's are negative, as I saw, up to the 88th percentile. But they're getting this big green trend precisely because the bias has a dynamic that's very large. Again, it doesn't question their descriptive fact. As a descriptive fact, they're completely right. But its economic interpretation is very different, I think, once you start looking at it this way. What about the other outcomes? Well, all the other outcomes converge from the beginning of the sample. So the bias issue doesn't at least change sign, but it's the same thing. Here is the distribution for all the other outcomes. And you see that in all of them up to the 75th percentile, the convergence coefficient is much more negative than what they get as the pool coefficient. So the problem is present for the other ones as it is for GDP, but it's much more consequential in terms of economic interpretation for GDP, in my opinion. All right, what about the estimating the correlate growth slope? So this is the model now that they estimate. So now they introduce the beta, and I'm going to introduce the beta as in the underlying data generating process. But there are a couple of differences again. Most importantly, this is the big deal. This is alpha instead of alpha C, no cross-country fixed effects. No cross-country specific coefficients. This may be important, but it's not. But it also uses this 10-year difference on the left-hand side, rather than, you know, if you have the annual data, perhaps it's more natural to model the annual data. So here is their result. In the original version that we had, they were comparing 1985 to 2005. Now they are doing it a little bit more like we were doing also. So if you estimate this, you see this decline. Now the first thing to note is, well, this isn't exactly a downward trend. It looks more like a cosine here. That already gives me some pause. Where is that coming from? Well, we don't understand it exactly, but if you estimate their model exactly, Again, we're replicating exactly their results. There's no mistake in their model, in their estimation whatsoever. It's just a matter of interpretation. But if you re-estimate their model with a more interpretable, in my opinion, annual change on the left-hand side, you don't see the same cosine. There is some fluctuation, and there are some correlated effects that you're missing because you only have one lag, and GDP lags are a little bit more complicated. And also, polity is very error-prone, is not a great measure of democracy. I'll come back to that in a second. So I think there's some combination of these things that's leading to this cosine pattern. But if you do it as annual, it's already not super large. But I think the more important thing, I want to go back to thinking about this in a causal framework. So to do that, let me go back to my paper with Suresh Naidu, Pasquale Restrepo, and James Robinson. And in that model, this is exactly what we estimated. It's equivalent to the model that I wrote, except that I put level on the left-hand side rather than change, but it's, of course, it's just a reorganization. I put it this way because this is exactly the model in that paper. The only X that we consider is this democracy index. And we use a dichotomous measure of democracy constructed from multiple sources to minimize measurement error. It turns out it matters a little bit. You don't get anything different, but you get much more imprecision when you have things like polity, which have so much error and mean reversion themselves. So what happens if you estimate this? This is we are replicating exactly the leading specifications from that paper with 4 lags on the right-hand side. It doesn't matter whether we have 4 lags or 1 lag, but the 4 lags are important because of those dynamics that I showed you actually. So if you do the standard panel estimator, you get a democracy coefficient that's large and precise. You can do Arellano-Bond, different sort of GMM, or you can do Hausmann-Hahn, Kirsteiner, which deals differently with the non-stationarity issues. They all are in the ballpark, and then this is the IV, not the world's perhaps most reliable IV, but we developed one using waves of democracy that are regional, very different source of variation than the within one exploits, and they are all very consistent. So again, there is no contradiction here between what we are doing and what the authors are doing. They're finding these correlations as well. But these are estimated from a model, as I pointed out, that have the cross-country fixed effects. Now, if you were to go back to this sample and estimate these models without the cross-country fixed effects, and I didn't bring those actually, perhaps we should have put them in here as well, you don't get anything that looks like this. The cross-country fixed effects are very important both statistically, but they are also very important economically. So now what happens if you take this model and you ask the same question that Jack, Young, and Michael do, but in this model that I think is closer to a causal framework? Has the effect of democracy changed? So I take exactly the same estimates and now interact democracy with a time trend. And what you'll see is that when you estimate that, all of these are positive. Some of them are significant, some of them are not, and they are quantitatively not small. So there is, I wouldn't say on the basis of this that democracy is becoming more important in the 2000s than in the 1960s or the 70s, but I would certainly say that there is no evidence that democracy is getting less important. I can't do this exercise for other covariates because we don't have enough of a exogenous component IV and something that I can really trust. And there's also a bunch of semi-parametric matching estimators, etc., that we did in the paper that gives me confidence. But I want to now use this framework for my last point, squaring the circle. Now let's go take this democracy model as the only X, as opposed to the many X's that I think all the authors are, of course, right, are relevant. But let me just take that one single X and say, now this is the full model. And go back to evaluate the absolute convergence trends. And that's this. So here I'm showing you 4 numbers and their evolution over time. The dark gray are Kremer et al.'s specification. As they show, they start positive, absolute divergence, and they become negative. The orange, green, sorry, blue and green are the models that have the cross-country fixed effects, and they vary only to the extent of whether you allow cross-country convergence terms and whether you allow the effect of democracy to be present, and whether that's also cross-country varying across countries or not. So you see that in none of those cases you have the dynamics that the authors find. They're fairly flat. there's a little bit of specification fluctuation across decades, but as you can see, it's well within the 2 standard error bands very comfortably. But most importantly, you may be misled from this figure, thinking that we are in the ballpark when you do the Kremer et al. Specification versus these specification. No, the black is on a different scale. Here is the black scale. Here is the other scales.
Daron, just
Black
interrupt.
one is tiny.
Daron, 2-minute warning.
Okay, I'm almost done. So that's my point from the earlier on, Carlos and my proposition 1. The raw hat is seriously biased towards 0 if you're going to interpret it from an economic point of view rather than just a descriptive fact. Conclusion. This is a very interesting paper. It was very thought-provoking for Carlos and me to think about it. And certainly there's a new interesting descriptive fact. But this is a descriptive fact and we should not interpret it as an economic fact. It's a statistical framework and I don't think it corresponds to an economic framework where we can talk of the causal effects. I think if you're going to think about the causal effects, you really have to recognize, A, the fact that many countries are on very different level differences, and those level differences are not going to be undone during the sample period that we have, even if you have some amount of policy convergence. Those are what the country fixed effects are. And they're fairly stable, as I've shown you. Again, I didn't show you that exactly, but they are fairly stable. And you also want to take more care, I think, in terms of zeroing in on the relevant covariates or correlates, such as democracy, and think about their effects. And here, endogeneity, dynamics, etc., are going to be important. When you do that, and you definitely do not overturn the author's descriptive fact, but you, I think, find a somewhat different conclusion. Unconditional convergence patterns at the country level haven't changed. The raw Cs haven't changed. There's no evidence that the raw Cs have changed. The causal effects of democracy has not declined or disappeared in any way. There is no evidence of instability in the underlying structural relationships. This puts a somewhat different light on the dynamics that we have observed, but obviously the authors are completely right that the inequality patterns across countries has changed, and we have to take that at face value, and it will have implications, including in the domains that Rohini already emphasized. So thanks again to the authors for giving me and Carlos an opportunity to think about these issues, and to Erik and Marty for inviting us to do it.